July 4th, 1857. Independence Day. The rest of America is lighting fireworks, singing songs, celebrating 81 years of freedom. But in Lower Manhattan, on a stretch of cobblestone between Bayard Street and the Bowery, 800 men are trying to kill each other. Brickbats fly from rooftop windows. Paving stones crack skulls open on the street. Knives flash in the gaslight. Pistol shots echo off tenement walls. A man staggers out of the crowd on Chatham Street, his face split open from temple to jaw, and collapses into the mud. Nobody stops to help him. The New York Times will later report the scene like this. Brickbat stones and clubs were flying thickly around from windows in all directions. Wounded men lay on the sidewalks and were trampled about. By the time it ends, somewhere between 8 and 30 people are dead. 1,000 are injured. And the New York State Militia is marching down White Street with fixed bayonets because 2 police forces, a corrupt mayor, and every gang in Lower Manhattan have turned America's birthday into a war zone. This was not a movie scene. This was real. This was the Dead Rabbits riot of 1857, the single bloodiest gang battle in New York City history up to that point. And here is what you need to understand. The movie Gangs of New York showed you one battle, one dramatic clash between 2 gangs on one afternoon. Martin Scorsese compressed everything into a neat, cinematic finale. But the reality was not one battle. It was a 20-year war, over 200 gang fights in a single decade, political assassinations, Election Day massacres, women who filed their teeth into points and wore brass claws into combat, a dead animal impaled on a wooden pike, carried through the streets as a battle flag. The real Dead Rabbit story makes the movie look tame. This is the story of the most feared street gang in 19th century America, how they were born from a superstition, how they turned violence into political power, how they waged a war that shaped New York City, and how everything you think you know about them, thanks to Hollywood, is wrong. But before we get to the blood, the politics, and the dead rabbit on a pike, you need to understand where this all started. Because nobody joins a gang for fun. They join because there is nothing else. Picture Manhattan in the 1830s. Not the Manhattan, you know, not skyscrapers and taxis and Broadway lights. This Manhattan smells like death. Specifically, it smells like the rotting remains of a 48-acre pond that used to be the city's main source of drinking water. They called it Collect Pond. For 2 centuries, New Yorkers drank from it, fished in it, swam in it. Then the tanneries moved in, the breweries, the slaughterhouses. They dumped everything into that water until it turned black. By 1811, the city filled the whole thing in with dirt and built houses on top of it. You know what happens when you build a neighborhood on top of a landfill over a poisoned lake? The ground sinks. The houses shift on their foundations. The streets, which are not paved, turn into rivers of mud mixed with human waste and animal filth. Mosquitoes breed in the standing water. Cholera moves in and never leaves. And the people who live there, they are the ones who cannot afford to live anywhere else. This was 5 Points, named for the intersection where 5 crooked streets met in Lower Manhattan. Anthony Street, Orange Street, Cross Street. The spot where they all converged became the most dangerous patch of ground in America. By the 1840s, 5 Points had the highest murder rate of any slum in the world. Not just New York, the world. Only parts of London's East End came close in terms of population density, infant mortality, and violent crime. When Charles Dickens visited in 1842, he was horrified. And this was a man who had seen the worst poverty in England. At the center of it all sat a building called the Old Brewery, originally Coulthard's Brewery, built in the 1790s. By 1837, after the economic panic, nobody was brewing anything. So the owners converted it into a tenement, 5 stories, over 1,000 people crammed inside. The lower floors, which once had high ceilings for brewing equipment, were carved into tiny cubicles. No light, no air, no plumbing, large families in single rooms. Men, women, children, animals, all living on top of each other. Urban legend said the old brewery averaged a murder a night for 15 years. That number is almost certainly exaggerated. But the fact that people believed it tells you everything about what kind of place 5 Points was. Now, into this nightmare pour 1 million Irish. The Great Famine hit Ireland in 1845, and over the next decade, over 1.5 million Irish immigrants flooded into New York City. Most of them landed at the docks with nothing, no money, no connections, no skills that translated to an American city, and the only place they could afford to live was 5 Points. They packed into the cellars and tenements alongside the black families and German immigrants who were already there. The streets were so narrow that people on opposite sides of the road could reach out their windows and shake hands. You have to understand what this did to people. You are 20 years old. You survived a famine that killed 1 million of your countrymen. You crossed an ocean in a coffin ship where 1/4 of the passengers died of typhus. You arrive in New York, and the first thing you learn is that nobody wants you here. Shop windows say, "No Irish need apply." The newspapers call you a drunken savage. Cartoonists draw you with an ape's face. The nativist Americans, people who came over 2 generations earlier and now consider themselves the real Americans, want you deported or dead. So what do? You find your people. You form a gang. Not for fun, for survival. The first major Irish gang in 5 Points was the Roach Guards. Named after a local saloon keeper, they became the largest Irish criminal organization in early 19th century Manhattan. Well over 100 members when called up for a fight. They controlled the blocks around Mulberry Street. They ran protection rackets, picked pockets, cracked skulls. But more importantly, they protected the neighborhood. If a nativist gang came into 5 Points looking for trouble, the Roach Guards met them at the border. Now here is where the story gets interesting. And here is where the movie got it completely wrong. Sometime in the 1830s, the Roach Guards had a meeting. The accounts vary on exactly when and where. But what is documented is this. During a heated argument over the direction of the gang, someone threw a dead rabbit into the center of the room. Just hurled a dead animal across the table. Some members looked at it and saw an omen, a sign. The kind of dark symbol that meant something in a world where superstition was survival. Those members withdrew from the Roach Guards that night and formed their own gang. They called themselves the Dead Rabbits. Now here is the thing most people do not know. The historian Tyler Enbinder, one of the foremost scholars of 5 Points history, argues that the Dead Rabbits may never have existed as a separate gang at all. His research suggests that after the 1857 riot, reporters relied heavily on the Bowery Boys for information. The Bowery Boys, being their enemies, used the slang term dead rabbit to describe the Roach Guards. In street slang of the era, a dead rabbit meant a thief, a low character, a nobody. The press loved the name. It was colorful, it was memorable, and it stuck. The actual members of the gang wrote letters to the newspapers after the riot, insisting that their name was the Roach Guard, not the Dead Rabbits. Nobody listened. But here is what matters. Whether they were a splinter faction or simply the Roach Guards with a new name, the gang that the world came to know as the Dead Rabbits was real. Their violence was real. Their power was real. And that battle standard, the dead rabbit impaled on a wooden pike that they carried into every fight, according to the traditional accounts, that was real too, although Enbinder himself disputes even this detail. He flatly stated, "There was definitely no rabbit on a pike being brought to a riot. The truth, as always, sits somewhere in the middle. But the legend? The legend is what built an empire. Throughout the 1840s and 1850s, the Dead Rabbits operated along Mulberry Street in 5 Points. The New York City Police Department gave them the nicknames Mulberry Boys and Mulberry Street Boys because that was their territory. Their criminal activities ranged from street fighting and knife fighting to assault, robbery, arson, and murder. But petty crime was the floor. The ceiling was politics. You have to understand how democracy worked in 19th century New York. It did not work the way your civics teacher told you. Elections were not decided by informed voters making rational choices. Elections were decided by whoever controlled the polling stations. And controlling the polling stations meant having enough men with enough weapons to make sure the right people voted and the wrong people stayed home. Enter Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine that ran New York City for most of the 19th century. Tammany needed muscle. The dead rabbits needed protection. It was a perfect arrangement. Under the leadership of a man named Isaiah Rinders, the dead rabbits became Tammany Hall's enforcement arm. Rinders was a former Mississippi River gambler who had moved to Manhattan around 1837 and founded the Empire Club, which was essentially a front operation for recruiting what they called shoulder hitters, paid thugs, street fighters who would show up at polling stations, opposition rallies, and political meetings to make sure the Democratic candidates won. This is how it worked. On Election Day, the Dead Rabbits would station men at every polling place in the 6th Ward. If you were an Irish immigrant who planned to vote Democratic, they let you through. If you were not, you had a problem. They would block the entrance. They would threaten you. If you pushed back, they would beat you in the street in broad daylight. And nobody stopped them, because the police worked for the same politicians. Rinders used these tactics to help deliver New York's electoral votes for James K. Polk in 1844, then Franklin Pierce in 1852, then James Buchanan in 1856. 3 consecutive presidential elections influenced by gang violence in Lower Manhattan. The Dead Rabbits were not just thugs. They were a political organization with fists, but every empire needs enemies. And the Dead Rabbits had the perfect one. The Bowery Boys. Based in the Bowery neighborhood just north of 5 Points. Everything the Dead Rabbits were, the Bowery Boys were the opposite. The Dead Rabbits were Irish Catholic immigrants. The Bowery Boys were native-born Protestant Americans. The Dead Rabbits backed Tammany Hall Democrats. The Bowery Boys backed the Know Nothing Party, the nativist political movement that wanted to ban Catholic immigration entirely. The Dead Rabbits lived in the worst slum in America. The Bowery Boys came from a more prosperous working-class neighborhood. They worked as volunteer firemen, butchers, and mechanics. They wore stovepipe hats and red shirts. They did not just want the Irish out of their neighborhood. They wanted them out of the country. The leader of the Bowery Boys during their peak was a man named William Poole. You know him by his other name, Bill the Butcher. Born in 1821, Poole was a professional butcher by trade and a bare-knuckle boxer by reputation. He stood over 6 feet tall, weighed over 200 pounds, and was, by all accounts, one of the most dangerous men in New York City. He was also violently anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, and proud of it. The character Daniel Day-Lewis played in Gangs of New York was based on this man. But here is what the movie changed. In the film, Bill the Butcher is the main villain. He kills the leader of the Dead Rabbits in an opening battle and rules 5 Points for 16 years. In reality, Bill the Butcher never controlled 5 Points. He controlled the Bowery. And he did not die in a climactic final battle. He died in a saloon. On the other side of the war was a man named John Morrissey. Born February 12, 1831, in County Tipperary, Ireland, Morrissey arrived in New York as a teenager with nothing but his fists. He became a bare-knuckle boxer, eventually winning the American Heavyweight Championship by defeating a fighter named Yankee Sullivan in the 37th round at Boston Corners, Massachusetts, on October 12, 1853. But Morrissey was more than a boxer. He was the leader of the Dead Rabbits, a collection agent for Tammany Hall, and the man who would eventually order the killing of Bill the Butcher. In August of 1854, Morrissey and Poole finally fought each other. Not in a ring, on the street, at the corner of West and Amos Street. Poole won that fight. He was bigger, stronger, and meaner. Morrissey walked away humiliated. But he did not forget. In February of 1855, 2 of Morrissey's associates, Lou Baker and Jim Turner walked into Stanwix Hall, a saloon on Broadway, and shot Bill the Butcher. Poole lingered for 14 days before dying on March 8, 1855. His last words became a rallying cry for the nativist movement. "Goodbye, boys. I die a true American." Morrissey was indicted for the murder. 3 trials, 3 hung juries. He walked free. With Bill the Butcher dead, the balance of power shifted. But the war did not end. It escalated. Remember this name, Fernando Wood, because without him, the Dead Rabbits riot never happens. Fernando Wood was the mayor of New York City. He served as both the 73rd and 75th mayor, and he was one of the most corrupt politicians in American history. Wood was a Tammany Hall man through and through. He had deep connections to the gangs of 5 Points, and the gangs had helped elect him. But by 1857, the New York State Legislature had had enough of Wood's corruption. In April of that year, the legislature voted to take control of the city's police force, the Metropolitan Police, out of Wood's hands. Wood's response? He refused. He created his own personal police force, the Municipal Police, comprised almost entirely of loyal Democrats. So now New York City had 2 competing police forces. The state controlled metropolitans and the mayor's municipals. They did not cooperate. They did not communicate. They actively fought each other. On June 16, 1857, less than 3 weeks before the Dead Rabbits riot, the 2 police forces had their own riot, right on the steps of City Hall. The municipal police tried to physically remove Metropolitan Police Commissioner Daniel D. Conover from the building. The Metropolitans showed up to defend him. Police officers, sworn to uphold the law, beat each other bloody on the steps of government. This is what New York City looked like in the summer of 1857. No functioning police force, a corrupt mayor at war with the state. And into that power vacuum stepped every gang in the city. Then the economy collapsed. The Panic of 1857 hit New York like a sledgehammer. The Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company failed, triggering a chain reaction of bank closures across the country. Businesses shut down. Tens of thousands of workers lost their jobs overnight. In the Bowery, the working-class men who made up the Bowery Boys saw their incomes disappear. In 5 Points, the Irish immigrants, who were already barely surviving, found themselves with absolutely nothing. The Dead Rabbits gained recruits because desperate men need somewhere to belong. But recruiting was one thing. Feeding them was another. By the 4th of July, the city had been in a near-perpetual state of civil unrest for over a month. The police riot, the economic collapse, gangs roaming the streets with nothing to do and nothing to lose. All it needed was a spark. On the evening of July 4th, 1857, while the rest of New York celebrated Independence Day, a coalition of 5 Points gangs assembled. The Dead Rabbits led the charge. The Plug Uglies joined them. So did the Shirt Tails. They marched into the Bowery with one target in mind. A clubhouse at 40 or 42 Bowery, depending on which source you trust, that served as a headquarters for the Bowery Boys and the Atlantic Guards. What happened next was chaos. A small squad of Metropolitan Police officers tried to break up the fight on Center Street. The gangs turned on them. The officers were beaten and forced to retreat. The Dead Rabbits opened a second front on Bayard Street. 200 Bowery Boys came charging down to rescue the Metropolitans. The fighting spread to Pearl Street, to Chatham Street, back to the Bowery. Brickbats and paving stones rained from tenement windows. Men fought with knives, iron bars, axe handles, and pistols. Thousands of spectators watched from doorways and rooftops, while looters moved through the chaos, robbing every shop and bar in sight. Between 800 and 1,000 gang members took part in the fighting. Several hundred more used the disturbance to loot the entire Bowery area. The police could do nothing. Each police faction, the municipals and the metropolitans, blamed the other. Isaiah Renders himself, the 6th Ward boss, the man who had built the Dead Rabbits into a political weapon, tried to restore calm. The gangs attacked him, too. Now here is one of the most famous characters from this era, and one the movie barely touched, a woman they called Hellcat Maggie. According to the legend that Herbert Asbury recorded in his 1898 book, The Gangs of New York, Hellcat Maggie was a dead rabbits fighter who filed her teeth to razor-sharp points and wore custom-made brass fingernails into battle. She would charge into a brawl and literally bite and claw her opponents. Whether she was real or an Asbury embellishment is a matter of historical debate. But the fact that 5 Points produced women who fought alongside the man in full-scale street warfare is documented. The Dead Rabbits were not a gentleman's club. They took anyone who could throw a punch. The riot raged through the night. It renewed the next day. On July 5th, the Roach Guards, who had been sitting out the fight, finally joined the 5 Points coalition. Both sides were reinforced by gangs from across the city. The Dead Rabbits pushed further north and attacked a bar on Broome Street. The fighting was now spread across multiple neighborhoods. At least 12 people died on the first night alone, though the true number is believed to be higher. Gangs had a habit of dragging away their dead and burying them in cellars. The official count says 8 killed and between 30 and 100 injured across both days. Roughly half of the injured required hospitalization, but those numbers almost certainly undercount the dead. When you are fighting in alleys and basements in a neighborhood where the police cannot even agree on whose job it is to show up, bodies disappear. The riot finally ended on the evening of July 5th when the New York State Militia arrived. Major General Charles W. Sanford led the 8th and 71st Regiments down White and Worth Streets with fixed bayonets. The show of force was enough. The gangs panicked and fled back to their hideouts, but sporadic fighting continued for days afterward. It was the largest civil disturbance in New York City since the Astor Place riot of 1849, and it would hold that record until something far worse came along 6 years later. But here is what the movie does not tell you. The Dead Rabbits riot was not the climax. It was not the final battle. It was one chapter in a war that lasted decades. Throughout the 1850s alone, the Dead Rabbits fought over 200 documented gang battles against the Bowery Boys and their allies. Not one epic showdown like Hollywood wants you to believe. Hundreds of street fights, ambushes, raids on clubhouses, knife attacks in alleys, Election Day brawls that left men bleeding on the steps of polling stations. The movie showed you the Super Bowl. The reality was a 20-year season of violence where somebody got hurt almost every week, and historian Tyler Anbender said it plainly. Gangs were not fighting in the streets every day, not even every month, often not even every year. The huge melees depicted in the movie were very rare events, and the kind of Super Bowl of gang warfare did not take place in the 19th century in 5 Points. The big battles were rare. The grinding, low-level violence was constant. That distinction matters, because it tells you something about what the Dead Rabbits actually were. They were not a cinematic army. They were a survival mechanism. There is more. The movie shows 5 Points as a lawless hellscape where you could not walk 10 feet without being robbed or murdered. And Binder corrects that too. The neighborhood was not nearly as lawless as the movie implies. There were robberies, to be sure, especially at night, but people were not afraid to walk through the neighborhood in the daylight hours. 5 Points was poor. 5 Points was dangerous at night. But it was also a functioning community where families raised children, went to church, and tried to build something out of nothing. Reducing it to a war zone is what Hollywood does. The truth is more complicated, and honestly, more interesting. The movie also gets the old brewery wrong. In the film, it is shown as a massive open space, almost like an underground cathedral where gangs hold court. In reality, no landlord in 5 Points would waste space like that. The old brewery was carved into tiny cubicles to fit as many paying tenants as possible. It was not dramatic. It was claustrophobic. That is worse. Now, let us talk about the final chapter. July 13th, 1863. 6 years after the Dead Rabbits riot, The Civil War is raging. The Union Army needs soldiers. And Congress has just passed the Enrollment Act, which establishes a military draft. Any man between 20 and 45 can be called to serve. But here is the catch that set New York on fire. If you had $300, you could pay a substitute to go in your place. $300 in 1863 was roughly a year's wages for a working man, which meant the rich stayed home while the poor went to die at Gettysburg. In 5 points, the Irish took it personally. They had fled a famine. They had been spat on, beaten, and excluded since the day they arrived. Now the government wanted them to fight and die in a war to free black Americans, whom the Irish saw as competition for the lowest rung of the economic ladder. The draft offices opened on Saturday, July 11th. By Monday, the city was on fire. The New York City draft riots lasted 4 days, July 13th through July 16th, 1863. They remain the largest civil disturbance in American history. Mobs of working-class white men, many of them Irish, attacked draft offices, police stations, and government buildings. Then the violence turned racial. Mobs hunted black residents through the streets. They burned the Colored Orphan Asylum at 43rd Street and 5th Avenue to the ground. 11 black men and boys were lynched over 5 days. One man was attacked by a crowd of 400, beaten with clubs and paving stones, hanged from a tree, and set on fire. The dead rabbits were in the middle of it. The New York Times reported that gang members from across the eastern seaboard converged on the city for the violence. Plug Uglies and Blood Tubs from Baltimore, Schuylkill Rangers from Philadelphia, and from 5 Points, the Dead Rabbits and the Mackerelvillers fighting alongside them. The official death toll was listed at either 119 or 120 individuals. But historians like James M. McPherson have estimated the true number could be as high as 1,200. President Abraham Lincoln was forced to divert several regiments fresh from the Battle of Gettysburg to retake the city. By the time order was restored, more than 4,000 soldiers were garrisoned in Manhattan. The draft riots were the Dead Rabbits' last stand. Not because the gang was destroyed in the fighting, but because the world they had built was already dying. The Civil War changed everything. The federal government demonstrated that it could and would use overwhelming military force to crush civil unrest. Tammany Hall adapted, moving away from street gangs toward more sophisticated forms of corruption. The 5 Points neighborhood itself began to change as new waves of immigrants arrived and the old Irish families moved uptown. And John Morrissey, the bare-knuckle champion who had led the Dead Rabbits and ordered the killing of Bill the Butcher, did something nobody expected. He went legitimate. In 1866, Morrissey ran for Congress with the backing of Tammany Hall. He won. He served 2 terms in the United States House of Representatives, from 1867 to 1871. Then he turned on Tammany, testifying against the corrupt Boss Tweed. He ran as an anti-Tammany Reform Democrat for the New York State Senate and won. He also founded the Saratoga Racecourse, which still operates today. The man who had started as a 5 Points street fighter died on May 1, 1878, as one of the most respected politicians in New York State. That is the real story. Not one battle. A 20-year war. Not a simple gang of thugs. A political organization that shaped elections, toppled rivals, and produced a United States congressman. Not the version Hollywood sold you. Something messier, uglier, more complicated, and far more human. Think about what the Dead Rabbits actually were. They were starving immigrants who arrived in a country that despised them. They lived in the worst conditions in the Western world. They formed organizations for self-defense that became criminal enterprises, that became political machines. They used the only currency they had, violence, and they spent it until there was nothing left. The movie wanted you to see a dramatic showdown between good and evil. The reality is that there was no good side. There were desperate people on every side of every fight. Irish immigrants who had nowhere else to go. Nativist Americans who feared losing their country. politicians who exploited both groups, and cops who could not even agree on who was in charge. You want to know what the Dead Rabbits riot really proved? It proved that democracy does not work when institutions fail. When the police are divided, when the mayor is corrupt, when the economy collapses, when immigrants are treated like animals, the streets fill with blood. That is not ancient history. That is a pattern. And if you think it cannot happen again, you have not been paying attention. The Dead Rabbits carried a dead animal on a pike as their flag. They fought over 200 battles in 10 years. They put a United States congressman in office and had a president's assassin killed in a barroom. They terrorized the Bowery, controlled the polls, and burned half of Manhattan during the draft riots. And then they vanished. Not in a blaze of glory like the movie showed you, slowly, quietly, the way all gangs die. Not from one final battle, but from a world that moved on without them. 5 Points is gone now. The intersection where 5 streets met is buried under the New York City Civic Center and the edge of Chinatown. The old brewery was demolished in 1852. The tenements were torn down. The streets were renamed. Worth Street, Baxter Street, Park Street. You can walk through it today and never know that you are standing on the most violent patch of ground in American history. But the Dead Rabbits, their name survived. Not because of what they did, but because of a story, a dead animal thrown across a room, a legend that may not even be true. A name that their enemies gave them as an insult, that the press turned into a headline, and that Hollywood turned into a myth. That is the real lesson of the Dead Rabbits. In the end, the story always outlives the truth, and the truth is always more dangerous than the story. If you found this one fascinating, hit subscribe. We drop a new documentary every week. And drop a comment. Tell me, what part of this story surprised you the most? What other forgotten chapter of American history should we cover next?